Welcome back. This is part one. We just saw part two. So actually there are some advantages to seeing part two before part one, because it tells you where part one is going. But I'm going to speak now about Hitler and Hamas. I mean, the line or the thread of anti-Semitism that runs through National Socialism into Islamic jihadism, and I use Hamas as kind of the emblem here of Islamic jihadism. This image is a photograph of a kite used by Hamas to send incendiary devices into Israel. And on a number of their kites, they have a swastika. Interestingly. So I think there are deep connections between National Socialists and Islamic jihadists. I mentioned earlier that the Protocols of the Elders of Zion for the jihadists, as well as for Hitler, is a proof text. It's scripture, so to say. I can prove that the whole existence of the Jews is based on a continuous lie because it says so in the protocols. Similarly, I can prove, that the Jews have evil and nefarious intentions because it's right here in the protocols. Now, the protocols, as some of you may know, is a fabrication compiled by Pyotr Ivanovich Rachkovsky around 1898, 1899. Rachkovsky drew on large portions of passages from two novels from the mid-19th century. One is called Biarritz by Hermann Goethe, and the other is a novel by a French writer named Maurice Joly called A Dialogue in Hell. The Protocols is published in the Russian periodical Znamya, which means the banner, in 1903. It didn't gain wide circulation so much until after the First World War. With the collapse of Austro-Hungarian Empire, the collapse of civilization, redrawing the map, huge, catastrophic, traumatic upheaval. And in Germany in particular, when it was announced that they'd lost the war, basically most of the German people said, "What? You told us like last week we're winning." None of the German cities were devastated, right? I thought we'd won. So how do you explain the fact that we've lost the war? It's the Durchstoß. We were stabbed in the back by the Jews. So the protocols, which initially appeared in Russian, suddenly translated into European languages and other languages. The protocols was translated into Arabic in 1926. Now, the anti-Semitism is foundational to the Nazi Weltanschauung, the Nazi view of the world. You can't be a Nazi and not be anti-Semitic. You can be a Republican and not be anti-Semitic. You can be a Democrat and not be anti-Semitic. You can be Labor, conservative, and be anti-Semitic or not anti-Semitic. You can't be a Nazi without anti-Semitism. So the Nazis were not anti-Semites because they were racist. They were racist because they were anti-Semites. Anti-Semitism, at least in this case, is not a subset of racism. It's not about scapegoating. It's not about economic envy or hate of the elitists. It's not about xenophobia. Certainly in Germany, the German Jews are more German than the Germans, right? They're not like the Ostjuden with these weird side curls and stuff like that. No, the Jew here is a metaphysical category. The Jew doesn't lie in anything that meets the eye. Or in anything, the hatred of the Jew is not rooted in anything that the Jews do. It's not as if they're all Al Capone or they're all crime families, they're murderers and rapists. No. It's nothing that they do and nothing you can observe. They are, as Hitler said, the invisible wire pullers. They control everything. Actually, I once had a student who was learning about the World Jewish Conspiracy and that the Jews control everything. The student said, "What would be wrong with that?" I thought, what? So it's not just that they control everything, but they are evil and they control everything. It's not that all Jews are evil, it's that all evil is Jewish. That's what makes the Jew into a metaphysical category. Now this, of course, is traceable, to the church fathers. There were people who hated Jews before the advent of Christianity. Democritus, in the 5th century before the Common Era, the Greek philosopher, claimed that Jews kill strangers on the highway and take them to offer up their blood in their temple. Tacitus declared the Jews to be, uncivilized. Yesterday we talked about being civilized. They're not civilized, they're not sophisticated because they refuse to engage in human sacrifice. So you have people who hated Jews prior to this, but it's with the advent of Christianity that the Jew becomes a theological category and not a part of an ethnic group or even exactly part of another religion. They're part of a covenant dispensation that has been superseded. So if they're part of a religion, it's an illegitimate religion. It's a false religion. It's not a religion at all. And it never was. You know, the other city, the other covenant has run its course, not in light but in shadow. They were always in the dark. John Chrysostom, even more virulent in his remarks than St. Augustine. What is the synagogue of the Jews who fight against God? It is, what is in the synagogue? It is the devil who leads them in their revels. So here you have this early demonization of the Jews. It's not that all Jews are evil. All evil is Jewish. All things Jewish are satanic. Now, how do we determine that? It's not just because they won't convert. It's because they know better than anyone that Jesus is the Messiah, whose blood has redeemed us from our sins, the one foretold by the prophets. They know better than anyone because they wrote the book on how you recognize him. The prophets, they know. So who would, in such a calculated manner, such a deliberate manner, reject salvation, reject redemption, except someone in league with the devil, with Satan? Right? So we're not talking, when you talk about the Jews, you're not talking about people in the Far East who never got the good word. The Jews created the good word, so to say. St. Jerome also, makes statements of this sort, demonizing the Jew. St. Jerome, of course, is famous as the translator of the Bible into Latin and to the Vulgate. Notice the move here, the theological eclipse of the Jew entails a theological appropriation of the word. you might wonder, I mean, as scholars, right, you might think, well, if you're going to study the text, you want to study it in the original language, don't you? Answer, no. God forbid. You have to study it in the language of the theological outlook that supersedes Judaism. And of course, the Vulgate is not just a translation like everything else of the translation, it's an interpretation. You know, you should see, I mean, if the looks on some students' faces who are very serious Christians that I've had, and they're very serious about their Bible. If I say to them, well, if you want to know what the Bible really says, learn Hebrew. Like, what? A person once said to me, asked me, have you ever read the Bible? No, a Christian, very devout Christian, wonderful, sweet, sweet person, not a scholar. In fact, I'd rather be around this person than many scholars I know. But this woman, she asked me, have you ever read the Bible? I said, well, yeah, I've studied it in Hebrew. And she said, yes, but have you read the King James Version? She thinks that's the original. Anyway, so this appropriation of the word is part of the delegitimization of the Jews. Now, fast forward to modernity. What happens in the shift to modernity is a shift in the ground for understanding the dearness, the value, the legitimacy of a human being. So the shift is inward. Some part of the self becomes the ground for salvation, for authenticity, for integrity, for purity, however you want, for righteousness, and so on. Faith becomes the only thing that justifies us, sola fide with Luther, reason with Kant, the passion of the folk with Wagner, or the will to power with Nietzsche. All of these things are summoned from within. This is a non-relational way of thinking of what constitutes our humanity, okay, and our value. These four people are very different in their thinking, right? But all four were quoted without editing by the Nazis. Gerhard Kittel, famous Lutheran theologian. Bruno Bauch, famous German Kantian, the editor of Kant Studien, premier journal of Kant studies, in 1922, distinguished himself by becoming the first philosopher to join the Nazi Party. By 1938, about half of the philosophy professors of Germany belonged to the Nazi Party. Of course, the Wagner family continued to had a very close association with Hitler under the Third Reich. Nietzsche, who's the philosopher who was deeply influenced by Nietzsche? You've all heard of him, I'm guessing. Martin Heidegger, right?
But I'm sorry, but Nietzsche himself was not anti-Semitic. His sister edited his work, and that was used by Nazis. The whole concept of the Übermensch is his. He has no concept of the Untermensch. They edited his work and used his work in such a way that it was ideal for propaganda. But Nietzsche himself had not.
No.
They didn't catch Nietzsche's irony.
Can I make a suggestion the way it works? Let David do this presentation and keep your critical comments and questions.
I can come back to it.
It's an important question.
It is an important question. It's not so much, are they anti-Semites? I mean, some of these are more than others. It's a question of what is the premise for determining the value of a human being? Okay. For Nietzsche, it's not relational. It's not obeying commandments from God. That much is the case, right? Which is kind of, you know, the Jewish outlook for what determines the value of a human being. So the question is, what is the anti-Semite anti, anyway? Or in the case of the Nazis, what are they trying to annihilate in the extermination of the Jews? They're trying to annihilate a certain ground for understanding the dearness and the value, the sanctity of the human being, or I should say the other human being. As you know, in Jewish teaching and tradition, the religious tradition, a human being has value because each human being is created in the image and likeness of the Holy One. Each human being, each soul emanates from the Holy One. Therefore, every soul is tied to every other soul through the origin, through the Creator. You see in this image, it's the hand on the right is the hand of God. I'm sure you've all seen this painting. And notice how God is desperately reaching out to Adam. This is an image of what Heschel calls God in search of man. God is longing for the connection, and the connection is made through the commandment. A commandment, a mitzvah, has as its root a tzavta, which means connection. So the commandment is not a rule to follow or an order to obey, it's a connection to be made. Who I am lies in that relationship between two. It doesn't lie in my inner will or resolve or faith or reason, for example. Okay? The fundamental to the understanding of who we are is this very simple, very familiar commandment to love the neighbor. But the komocha, as Levinas points out, komocha doesn't mean exactly as yourself. It certainly doesn't mean I know how much you love yourself and that's how much you should love your neighbor. I mean, some of us don't exactly love ourselves, right? It's the kamocha, is that is what you are like. You are the loving relationship toward your neighbor. So in the Hebrew phrasing, neighbor is not the object of the verb. It's the object of a preposition, le-re'echa. So be loving, be kind toward your neighbor. Treat your neighbor with loving kindness, whether you feel like it or not, whether you like them or not. If I wait till I feel like it, or if I rest on my feelings, I may never get around to it myself. Perhaps even more importantly than love of neighbor is love of the stranger. This commandment regarding how we treat the stranger appears 36 times, not this very wording, but a commandment regarding relation to the stranger appears 36 times in the Torah. It's fundamental. More frequently than any other commandment. It's the stranger, the one who's not like me, the one who doesn't come from my culture or my people or my religion. Who are the Chasdei Umot Ha'olam? The righteous among the nations are not the believers. They're the ones who behave in a certain manner. When Yad Vashem tries to identify one of the righteous to plant a tree from the Holocaust, they don't ask what did this person believe. They ask what did he or she do. Right? So each of us is connected to the other spiritually through the Creator. Each of us is connected to the other physically through Adam. You know, the rabbis ask, why does God begin with one and not with two? The rabbis thought of most of the questions we can think of. They really did. And one of the answers is so that no one can say to another, my side of the family is better than your side of the family. There's only one side, and we are a family. We are physically, biologically, genetically, DNA tied to each other and metaphysically tied to each other. Each of us is a Ben Adam, to use the Hebrew, a human being, which is a literal child of Adam. You can see how this would be inimical to Nazi teaching. It's inimical to a view of the human being as self-made, self-created, self-legitimized, self-authenticated through autonomy, through self-legislation, through resolve, through the will, which shapes a lot of modern thinking about humanity. So I'm suggesting that the foundational elements of Nazi thinking don't just come out of nowhere. They come out of centuries of Christian teaching about Jews and from fewer centuries of modern teaching concerning the human being. What justifies a human being? What legitimates a human being? Okay? Now, from a Nazi point of view, a human being has value on two counts. From the accident of being born an Aryan, already you're better. And if you're an Aryan, if you can summon a certain will to power, then you take on greater substance, greater meaning, greater depth. It's not through relation. In fact, the Nazi sense of humanity is based on something non-relational. I have no more to do with a Jew than I do with an insect. Right? Why? Because in my essence, in my soul, the Aryan, is radically different. So you have this notion of Rassenseele. Alfred Rosenberg is notorious Nazi ideologue. Rassenseele. This is not exactly like the way that at least we think of race in America, where it's largely about color. For the Nazi, it isn't reducible to color. German Jews are the same color as German non-Jews, pretty much. It's about essence. Rosenberg says that race and soul, character and thought these are all synonyms for the same thing. Our thought, our worldview is couched in our essence. It isn't something we arrive at, it's something already within us. So, what is poisoning the Aryan Geist, he says, the mind or spirit, is not just Jewish blood, it's Judaism. Because the ism is in the blood. Every Jew is a carrier of the disease. Religious or non-religious. If I say to you that the Nazis are trying to obliterate Judaism, the millennial teaching and testimony that the Jews represent by their very presence in the world, you might say, yeah, but what about the non-religious Jews? Rosenberg's answer is, the non-religious Jew is inclined to think Talmudically because the non-religious Jew is carrying the contagion.
Like Marx.
Yeah, they weren't the first. So this is a Nazi propaganda image from Der Stürmer. The Krankheitserreger, this means the contagion. You can see the little stars of David, the bacteria that threatens us under the microscope. And notice that you need a microscope to see it. It doesn't readily meet the eye. I need Alfred Rosenberg to open my eyes. I need the party. I need the folk. I need the apparatus to enlighten me to this, not just danger, but contagion. It's life-threatening. How many cases of smallpox are tolerable? It's okay if we have just a few. No, it's not okay. You want to get rid of smallpox, you get rid of every instance of it. This is a similar thinking vis-a-vis the Jews. I know that at least one of you have been to Tromsø, Norway, maybe more. There was one this morning who had also been to Tromsø when I was. Tromsø is pretty far north. Tromsø is 217 miles north of the Arctic Circle. Okay. In October 1943, having realized that there are 17 Jews who lived there, the Nazis went up and went after them and got them. Today you can see a memorial stone to those 17 Jews in the Arctic. This is not scapegoating. You don't have to go to the Arctic if you're just looking for a scapegoat. This is not xenophobia. This is not even bigotry. I would say it's not even racism. It has a metaphysical dimension that's driving it. And out of that metaphysics comes a kind of mythology. These are mythic images of the Aryan and the Jew. No Aryan actually looks like this guy, and no Jew actually looks like these images of Jews. And this is the ewige Jude, the eternal Jew. What does that mean? Oh, eternal. What does it mean? Eternal means metaphysical. In other words, eternal doesn't mean a long, long, long time. Eternal means it's a transcendent threat. It's the ubiquitous, invisible wire puller, as Hitler called it, as the source of all evil, now and forever, as invisible as Satan, now and forever. So there's kind of the Nazis don't really elaborate on this, but it's suggestive of a kind of eschatological scene, ultimately.
What's the date on this?
The ewige Jude, 35, 36?
1940.
1940, thank you.
Well, after the Nazis.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So here's the triumph. The Aryan triumph, again, is a triumph of the will, not of the good or the truth or justice, because those things are determined by the will. There was no concept of an unjust law in Nazi Germany. In fact, the Nazis were very careful to do everything in a lawful manner, in a legal manner. If you've read the protocols of the Wannsee Conference, you know that, which convened January 20th, 1942, you know that Heydrich was insistent that the Jews be exterminated in a legal manner. In a legal manner. Now, what does this have to do? How do we get to Hamas from here? If you were here earlier, you know about Hassan al-Banna. Hassan al-Banna had read portions of Mein Kampf early on. Mein Kampf was published in 1924 and 1925. And he became an admirer of Hitler. He based his propaganda program on what Hitler described propaganda. Hitler, who said that the aim of propaganda is not to inform or even to persuade, it's to incite what he called Zorniges Hasse, wrathful hatred. It's to incite. In 1938, the Muslim Brotherhood convened what they called a parliamentary conference of Muslim nations in Cairo, and at the conference they handed out passages translated from Mein Kampf and copies of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This Arabic language edition of Mein Kampf is actually a later edition translated by Louis al-Hajj, formerly known as Louis Haydn, who was a Nazi that converted to Islam. The Middle East was a destination for thousands of Nazi war criminals. And in his introduction, in Louis al-Hajj's introduction to the Arabic edition of Mein Kampf, he describes Hitler as a great jihadist. No. In fact, this man also described him as a great jihadist. Hajj al-Husseini. Hajj al-Husseini is really pivotal in the Nazi jihadist connection. Al-Husseini hooked up the Nazis with the Brotherhood around 1935. Al-Husseini visited the German consul Heinrich Wolf in March of 1933 to congratulate him on the emergence of the new regime. Hitler was appointed chancellor January 20th, 1933. While Al-Husseini was chatting with Wolf in Jerusalem, the Germans, the Nazis, were building Dachau outside of Munich. Al-Husseini was tried in absentia and convicted of inciting riots in Palestine in 1920. Now, in 1920, there was a lot of unrest in Palestine. The British Mandate had just been established. Some of the unrest was provoked by the Weizmann-Faisal Agreement in January 1919. Chaim Weizmann and King Faisal agreed, and wrote up an agreement that recognized the right, or recognized the legitimacy of the Balfour Declaration, saying that the Jews would have a homeland somewhere in that area. And of course, this stirred a great deal of controversy in that world. One of the, the most famous uprising and revolt incited by al-Husseini was the Arab Revolt of 1936. Matthias Kunzel, an important scholar on this topic, says that the Arab Revolt took place against the background of the swastika. Youth organizations paraded as Nazi scouts, and Arab children greeted each other with the Nazi salute. The Arabs in the region were very much aware of what was going on in the Third Reich. The Muslim Brotherhood sent delegations to the Nuremberg rallies in the 30s. The Nazis helped to fund the Arab Revolt by arrangement with Hajj al-Husseini. In 1936, the German Foreign Ministry, in case you're wondering, issued a statement saying that the Nuremberg laws of 35 do not apply to Arabs. When we're talking, Semites here, we don't mean Arabs. And indeed, these Islamic studies centers in Germany in Nazi Germany, were never shut down, although most of the scholars were German in those centers. So in 1937, October 13th, 1937, al-Husseini had to flee Palestine again because he was wanted by the British for inciting these riots. He fled to Lebanon and turned up in 1941 in Baghdad. Now, at least as of 1939, he was on the payroll for Nazi Germany. He went to Baghdad with some, Nazi backing to put together an uprising or a revolt against the Iraqi-controlled British government. But the British-controlled Iraqi government, not the British-controlled Iraqi government. Now, what's going on in the spring of 1941 on the continent? The Germans are preparing to move on the final solution. Operation Barbarossa had originally been planned for May 1st, 1941. The Wehrmacht got held up in the Balkans, and so they had to delay the invasion of the East till June 22nd, which is when the Einsatzgruppen, the killing units, went in to action. They're moving to the east. There's kind of an interesting parallel movement to the east as Haj Amin moves into Iraq to do a coup to get rid of the Iraqi government, which is backed by the British. It lasted about 6 weeks into May. One of the first things he did when they had control temporarily was to issue a fatwa against the British and against the Jews and so on. But the British came in at the end of May, and Haj Amin was once again on the run, but like the day before he left, June 1st, 41, he infamously incited this riot against the Jews of Baghdad called the Farhud. I was, a couple of years ago, I testified in Israeli court on behalf of survivors of the Farhud who were seeking reparations as Holocaust survivors. And of course, the Israeli Ministry of Finance doesn't let go of money very quickly. Who does? And so the state's position was they're not survivors of the Holocaust. And I was asked to testify to the extent that of German involvement through Haj Amin al-Husseini. And the last I heard a few months ago, this is still being litigated. But anyway, 600 Jews in Baghdad were killed. As you heard yesterday, there were about 130,000 Jews in Baghdad at that time. Hundreds of others were injured. So he flees, he's on his way out of town, goes to Tehran, from Tehran to Rome, from Rome to Berlin, where on November 28th of that year, he has his first meeting with Hitler. And discussing, November 41, by November 41, 700,000, 800,000 Jews had already been murdered by the Einsatzgruppen. The Holocaust was underway, although it wasn't called the Holocaust. Indeed, on August 24th, 1941, after getting reports from Eastern Europe, Winston Churchill in a radio broadcast said, "We are in the presence of a crime without a name." So here's Haj Amin. Soon after this meeting with Hitler, he met with Eichmann. He wrote, in his memoirs of this meeting, the following. He says, "Our fundamental condition for cooperating with Germany was a free hand to eradicate every last Jew from Palestine and the Arab world. I asked Hitler for an explicit undertaking to allow us to solve the Jewish problem in a manner befitting our national and racial aspirations and according to the scientific methods innovated by Germany in the handling of its Jews." The answer I got was, "The Jews are yours." Now, al-Husseini had 6 radio stations from which he would broadcast Arabic language Nazi propaganda, invariably including the injunction to kill the Jews because it pleases Allah. We saw, the jihadist notion in the last session that this is a religious duty and not just an unpleasant necessity. He had contacts with a number of the camp commandants, Franz Zierus of Mauthausen, Josef Kramer of Belsen, who else? Siegfried Seidel of Theresienstadt, of course Rudolf Hirsch of Auschwitz. But the person that al-Husseini worked most closely with was Heinrich Himmler himself. Working with Himmler, he set about recruiting Muslim killing units for the SS. I've read from one source that al-Husseini recruited up to 100,000 Muslims to serve in the SS. Frankly, it sounds a little high to me, but they were in the thousands. Probably the most notorious killing unit compiled, put together by al-Husseini was the Hamas Division, which had 22,000 Muslims. Most of them were from the Balkans and not Arabs. The commander of the Hamas Division, Carl Gustav Zauberzweig, commented that the Muslims in the Hamas unit see in our Führer the mission of a second prophet. So the Muslims in the killing units had mullahs, they had teachers working with them, well, teachers, people indoctrinating them. I mean, you might ask, how could Muslims get in bed with Nazis? Don't they have different worldviews? Don't they have different, well, Jew hatred is one thing. I mean, Jew hatred makes for strange bedfellows. But the Nazis said, when asked about, al-Husseini, oh, he's not really an Arab, he's Circassian. He's got that red hair, And as for Hitler, al-Husseini would say, well, he's actually a Muslim himself. He's just waiting to reveal himself. And in fact, the Ministry of Propaganda in Nazi Germany discussed the feasibility of a propaganda campaign among the Shiites, trying to convince them that Hitler was the 12th Imam. But they decided, probably wouldn't fly, probably wouldn't go over. Now, when the war ended, and I'm sorry about cutting off the date, it's 20th of June, 1946, Haj Amin al-Husseini was a wanted Nazi war criminal. He hid in France for about a year, turned up in Cairo, June 20th, 1946, where he received a hero's welcome. He was embraced as a great jihadist by al-Banna and Sayyid Qutb. And it's at this point that al-Husseini becomes officially tied to the Brotherhood. He had associations with the Brotherhood, but now he is one, so to say. As you know from the last discussion, the Brotherhood sent emissaries out throughout the region. One of the emissaries sent out was Ahmed Yassin, who was sent to Gaza in 1973 to set up an outpost for the Muslim Brotherhood. Yassin was one of the founders of the University of Gaza in 1978. And of course, on December 9th, 1987, he and a couple of other leaders, Mahmoud al-Zahar, Abdelaziz al-Rantisi, founded Hamas. December 9th, 1987. This is, you've seen statements like this in the last talk from jihadists. So, in order to get at what Hamas is about, one way to do that is to read the Hamas Charter. Now, we're not going to read all of it, but the preamble of the Charter contains a quote from Hassan al-Banna saying that Israel will exist, Israel meaning the Jewish people, will exist until they are wiped out. No, they are the eternal Jews. The second article declares Hamas to be part of the Muslim Brotherhood. As I may have mentioned earlier, in the Hamas Charter, there are three proof texts: the Quran, the Hadith, which is a vast body of text, and the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. As you read through the Charter of Hamas, which is the Charter of Allah, Hamas is Allah, you realize that this is not a statement of principles so much as a justification for exterminating the Jews. It's about the extermination of the Jews. So, I skipped maybe too fast. So in Article 7, one of the early articles, it's written, proof text, the Al-Bukhari Hadith. The Prophet, Allah bless him and grant him salvation, has said, the day of judgment will not come about until they kill the Jews. Until Muslims kill the Jews, the stones and trees will say, oh Muslims, oh Abdullah, there's a Jew behind me, come and kill him. The stones and the trees, nature itself, vomits up the Jews. The ontological landscape vomits up the Jews. There is no place for the Jews anywhere in nature, anywhere on the planet. As you know, according to Hamas, the only solution to the occupation in Palestine is jihad. There can be no negotiation. And they're very upfront about that. I mean, they're not going to trade any land for any peace. There can only be one peace. And that's with the annihilation of the Jewish state. For that reason, therefore, Article 15 ends with a refrain from the Hadith, I will assault and kill, assault and kill, assault and kill. To give you another example, I don't have this on a slide, Article 22, it says the Jews were behind the French Revolution, the Communist Revolution, and most of the revolutions we know about. With their money, they formed secret societies such as Freemasons, the Rotary Clubs, and the Lions Clubs. They do this in various parts of the world for the purpose of sabotaging societies and thereby advance Zionist interests. The Zionist interest is not putting settlements in the West Bank. The Zionists are interested in undermining societies. And corrupting mankind, enslaving mankind. With their money, they are able to control imperialistic countries and instigate them to colonize many countries in order to enable them to exploit their resources and spread corruption. So it's about spreading corruption. It's about spreading corruption. The charter goes on to say that after Palestine, they aspire to expand from the Nile to the Euphrates and beyond. The Jews are an expansionist people. Zion, Israel, Jewish state, is neither a homeland nor a haven like those lying Zionists would have you think. It's a base of operations. And in fact, in 1922, Alfred Rosenberg, whom I mentioned earlier, wrote a book on Zionism making this same case, that the Zionist movement is about establishing a base of operations. Okay? So it's not just that the land under occupation is, not West Bank, but Tel Aviv and Haifa. No, the land under occupation is the whole planet, you see. And this, as explained in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Now, what if the Jews were just to leave Palestine? Wouldn't that be okay? Not according to this Salafist sheikh, Mahmoud Hussein Yaqub, who in a radio broadcast in January 2009 says, if the Jews left Palestine to us, would we start loving them? Of course not. They are enemies not because they occupied Palestine. They would have been enemies even if they did not occupy a thing. Our fighting with the Jews is eternal. Once again, you got this eternal factor. Until not a single Jew remains on the face of the earth. It has to be total. You can't compromise or negotiate with the Jews any more than you can compromise or negotiate with Satan. Satan has to be obliterated everywhere, okay, for the sake of salvation, for the messianic mission, however you want to think of that. So, just a few ramifications of this. When the Jew is cast in these metaphysical categories, the Jew is rendered as invisible as Satan, so that the ideologue can proceed uninhibited. You don't have to, there doesn't have to be any show trials. You don't have to parade anyone in front of you in order to incite hatred of the Jews. Victory is all or nothing. It's an existential war. Like the Nazi war against the Jews, the jihadist war is against something far more than the Zionist entity. It's a metaphysical war. Okay, it seems to me. Among Hitler's last words, these are his last written words, hours before he committed suicide. He ends his political testament, so-called, by saying, "Above all, I enjoin the people to resist mercilessly the poisoner of all nations, international Jewry." Now, it seems to me that the movements where we see this summons heeded most systematically, most pervasively, most aggressively is in the Islamic jihadist movements. Not, in the far right, Aryan Nation, hold up in Idaho, or even Stormfront with their website. Disgusting, horrific, and dangerous people, right? White supremacists, the Aryan Nation, so on. Disgusting, dangerous, and so on. But they don't have an air force. They're not as vastly funded and organized and systematic as the Islamic Republic of Iran, for example, and the modern jihadist movement. So here you see the heirs to Hitler. These men on the right are actually not Hamas, they're Hezbollah, but you get the idea. It's the same kind of anti-Semitism. Now, I had a quote from James Clapper in my previous presentation. I couldn't go without quoting Jeremy Corbyn if I'm going to talk about Hamas, who describes Hamas as an organization dedicated to bringing about long-term peace and social justice and political justice. That may well be the case, but how does Hamas understand what is required for long-term peace, social justice, and political justice? That's what they want. That's what Sayyid Qutb wants. But that can be attained only through the elimination, extermination of the Jewish Satan. And so, the Islamic jihadists and the Islamic Republic of Iran have a highly systematized and highly sophisticated program to that end. Thanks. That's all. Yes.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation. One short remark and then a story that I would like to share.
Please.
It's interesting to see that Hitler referred to himself as a rational anti-Semite.
Yes.
He was not passionate, but a rational anti-Semite. Still, rather early, I think it was 34 or 35, the regime decided to not use the term anti-Semitism anymore,
Very interesting point. Thank you. Yeah, very interesting point.
This is as a small remark. The other thing is that we're talking about curricular development. So how is this presentation, your presentation, and the other presentations we heard connected to what we're actually doing, developing curricula? So why is Muslim anti-Semitism relevant? I was teaching a course in Oxford, in Germany, when Charlie Hebdo happened and the attack on the Jewish supermarket.
Mm-hmm.
So in the next session I said, what does that have to do with Islam? So I was asking it because this is how people talk. And then with two, I would say, Germans, maybe Catholic, maybe non-believers, who said, well, this has nothing to do with Islam, and people are misusing religion, you know, the things that people say. And then there was a woman in the back who was saying, well, I would like to comment as well. And she said, well, I'm a Muslim. I'm active in my community, and I haven't heard anybody speak out against Jews, and it wouldn't be tolerated. But in our community, like in Islam, anti-Semitism is a huge problem. And then she said how she thinks the biggest problem is that the preachers come from the Middle East and are allowed to preach in mosques in Europe and in Germany, and that she wishes like the German intelligence services and the police would be harder on them.
Mm-hmm.
And this is somehow, you know, when I ask myself, what am I doing actually teaching about anti-Semitism, and why do I teach about Muslim anti-Semitism? It's partly also because of her. Because I mean, who's in a really bad situation
Mm-hmm.
is the liberal Muslims. So they get it from their brothers, from the anti-Semites, and they get it from the political right, who's putting on the pressure, pointing their finger and saying, well, you're all anti-Semites anyway.
Well, I mean, you raised the question and you answered it, I think. It's important to teach it, just so someone like this woman knows that she has someone out there who hears her, supports her, at least in spirit, if not in word. I think the fight against anti-Semitism in any community, but including the Muslim community, requires Muslims being enlisted in the fight against anti-Semitism from within. Those individuals, as you know, take significant risks, even more than academics like me in the academy who defend Israel, which for junior faculty can also be risky. Me, I don't care. But no, but that's why you have to address it. So someone like that has some moral support so that those of us who don't have to take the risk, give that person a place to turn, someone to talk to. Because going out on a limb can put you in a very lonely position. So, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up. Very important. Yes, you say.
So it's clear up to this point, as I've been listening, that we have defined the parameters of what extremism means on the right. But it seems like we lack the specificity or the parameters for what leftist extremism is, until you just posted what Corbyn is, the Corbyn quote.
Yeah, there's going to be some sessions, I think, on Friday. In London, we'll talk about anti-Semitism from the left, which in some ways is even more important to address than anti-Semitism from the far right. Nobody's surprised that David Duke hates Jews. Yeah, so. But when it starts coming from the other direction, it's kind of, you do a double take. I mean, I have good friends in the UK, from the UK, always Labour Party people who are horrified by Corbyn, and they don't know what to do with it. This becomes, I don't know, for those of us in the academy, there's also kind of a certain trauma about, the pervasive silencing of anyone who speaks on behalf of Israel. Whether it's a speaker who comes in that is run off, or a professor. Well, those of us there know of examples of people. I know people who've lost jobs because of this. That also makes you do, hey, wait, wait a minute. I thought we had some notion of academic freedom, free speech and whatnot from, a liberal way of thinking. But that's not always the case. Yeah.
Well, in co-opting a certain kind of language, right, the social justice language and this idea of sort of the oppressed groups becomes a whole different kind of perspective when you put it within the language that Hamas or Hezbollah has used, right? And so an affinity of sorts seems to play into how that can merge.
Yeah, well, this is also a good point. The hatred of the Jew has to be couched in the discourse of righteousness, wherever it's coming from. That's why it entails the demonizing of the Jew, or the demonizing of the Jewish state, in my view. So that to be an anti-Zionist is the only moral thing you can be. It's the fashionable form, in my opinion, of anti-Semitism. And it's not about Israeli policy. It has nothing to do with Israeli policy. If you say Israeli policy, you might ask, well, which party you talking about? I talk about Nazi party in Germany, Communist party in Russia, that may be problematic. It's a party. There is no acceptable Israeli party to the anti-Zionist. It's not the policy of Israel that's a problem, it's the existence of Israel that's a problem. So that the obliteration of Israel becomes a moral imperative. For the jihadists, it's a religious imperative. For the more secular minded, in certain quarters, it's a moral imperative. Yes.
So I was really intrigued by the metaphysical eternal struggle that you're talking about.
Can you speak up just a little bit?
Yeah, sorry. So I was really intrigued by the metaphysical eternal struggle idea you were talking about, how it's kind of like a root, just idea with the cause. And I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts on why Christians don't have the same kind of zeal in practice. Because I know plenty of people back home from Georgia. I know plenty of people back home who are very devout Christians who actually believe they're like the Jews killed Jesus, we're against them for that. But I don't see, at least it's not talked about. There's no kind of in practice big kind of not conspiracy, but move to kind of eradicate Israel, eradicate Jews, etc.
Yes, among the Christians. The Christians are complicated. The American Christendom is quite different from European Christendom. My Christian students have never heard of the blood libel or the deicide. I mean, Jews killed Jesus, but it's not Jews killed God, therefore they are like Satan. Almost never have they left a sermon in Tennessee that ended with the words, now go beat up those Christ killers, the Jews. In places in Europe, many sermons used to end that way. Right? Yeah.
In Quebec,
Oh, yes.
that was regular.
Well, that's French. Quebec is more European than North American. I don't know. I'm telling you, I don't know what I'm talking about. So anyway, the Christian situation is quite different. The Christians, at least in many quarters among the Christian thinkers, after the Holocaust, there's been a real reassessment of their own history. There's an excellent, very short book called The Crucifixion of the Jews by Franklin Littell, a Christian, written for Christians, addressing Christians, and really holding their feet to the fire. saying, we Christians have a serious credibility problem. We have to deal with it. You don't see that in the Muslim world. Nobody is saying, gee, we got to come to terms with Hajj al-Husseini. No one I know of. Yeah, yes. Yeah.
I was wondering, sorry, if it's okay with Rivka, can you go back to the philosophical question? Do you want to raise
Well,
it?
it wasn't really a question. I think it's just, I think for me it's problematic when you're talking about thinkers that influence Nazism or Nazi ideology, and you put Nietzsche in that order or in that list, because he died in 1900. It was not his thought. Thus, to me, I'm not fit in that line. And it's his sister's doing that we now still associate his thinking with Nazi ideology. So I find it problematic when you put him next to Wagner, for example.
Okay.
That was my criticism.
Yeah.
Could we say that Nietzsche is deeply involved with anti-Judaism in terms of absenting it, while at the same time he was deeply opposed to anti-Semitism of the Wagnerian type? How about if we say it that way?
I didn't understand the first part.
So anti-Judaism is a movement within Western Civ that was imminent in the talk that begins with the early church fathers, which is not only does Judaism equal evil, what do you do with evil? You absent it, right? And so there's a reason why in Western civilization we never know anything about Judaism. Isn't that bizarre? It's a foundation stone, and it's not present like the Greeks are. There's no one in a position to defend Judaism through education because it's been absented for 2,000 years. And Nietzsche's very much part of that absenting in his writing. With the slave morality, the impact on Christianity. But you're absolutely right. He was also opposed to the hatred of the Jewish person as a human being. So I'm asking, can we split the difference that way? He's anti-Judaism, but he's still anti-Semitic. How's
I
that?
would also argue that his feelings about Judaism are also more connected to the fact that he doesn't agree with the whole concept of God.
This is irrelevant to me. He's still absenting Judaism. And as a Jew, it's deeply hurtful that someone of his caliber, who writes against Wagner, would step up like that. He's better than that, and he's still succumbed.
See, I would put forth that when you look at the slide that was presented, I don't see it so much as these individuals influencing Nazism. I see Nazism co-opting these individuals for what they wanted. So I appreciate exactly what you're saying, but I just look at it in a slightly different way in terms of the Nazis co-opting, whether it be Martin Luther or Wagner or Nietzsche.
But why didn't they co-opt Kierkegaard for that?
Charles, you want to stop?
I want to step back a minute. So I was just talking to Carlton the other day about Amis Césaire and discourse on colonialism. I think we have to take, has anybody read Césaire?
Yes,
Yeah, okay.
very powerful,
Okay, so, pardon?
very powerful.
Very valuable. So I think that in a sense, we have to be very careful about the founding philosophical figures like Nietzsche, like von Herder, all the people that justify the notion of belonging and otherness based on racism, justifying colonialism, carrying out genocide in Namibia, where the Nazis were trained to come back to Germany to commit and Poland to commit the Holocaust. So the notion of racial hierarchy, Hegel, Marx, this is all foundational Western philosophical thought.
Right.
So I think that to act surprised that some of these figures were co-opted, I think is a stretch. I think that the philosophies of these days were deeply, deeply racist and anti-Semitic. That's the foundation of Western colonial Christian society. And this, the Holocaust wasn't an aberration. It wasn't like a few years of a mistake. This stuff is deeply rooted in Western civilization. So I think to put this into a historical, philosophical, civilizational context is very important.
Sure, but
Yeah.
some of the names that were up there, Luther, we know he was anti-Semitic. Some of
Or
his
is
writings.
opposed to Nietzsche
And
was.
Herder, there are
Kant's writings against Judaism are pretty horrific.
Well,
Okay, sorry.
My point was concerned the emergence of how the human being, the value of a human being is conceived in the modern period, and the extent to which that can be exploited by National Socialism. You know.
On the subject of Nietzsche, I'd like to say that it's like the Nazis read Nietzsche, and they read this stuff about the blonde beast, and they said, oh wow, that's us. But Nietzsche's a critique of the blonde beast. Okay, that's it. On the subject of Christianity and these ideas, I mean, I mentioned earlier that it's under what we call apocalyptic time. The period where you think that you're actively bringing on the final resolution of sacred history. In that time, you can get these aberrations of Megadeth and breeding kids and so on. That can happen. In Christianity, it did happen. The Crusades, you know, the First Crusade had episodes where they literally slaughtered every Jew who didn't convert. So, yeah, you can have Christians behave that way. Right now, even though a lot of supersessionist stuff is sort of still hanging around in Christianity, like the Jews killed Christ, even though that's there, it's not activated because that's not how people are thinking. Now, there is one dimension of Christianity that's very apocalyptic, which is the what's called premillennial dispensationalism, which is the rapture people. And they tend to be pro-Zionist because they believe all the Jews have to go back to Israel before Jesus will come back. Now, at the moment, they're not in apocalyptic mode, but if they were to enter apocalyptic mode, there are some very serious dangers, and there's a whole book by, I think, Paul Boyer about the way in which the atomic bombs in America were actually armed by a Christian sect who believed that they were helping fulfill biblical prophecy because they interpreted Ezekiel and the animal.
Thank you, Richard.
Yeah, okay, yes.
No,
Question?
he said what I was going to say, so.
Okay.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, I don't want to respond to that. I'll respond to that later. But first I want to thank you very much for the presentation. I think it is enlightening. I've not made a connection between Nazis and Muslims before, and you've really helped me there.
Political Islam, not Muslim.
Okay, with Islam, let's put it that way. Yeah. I think that, the Western notions of Islam and Muslim is completely different from those of us who have Muslims as cousins and have lived with them all along.
No doubt.
But one observation I'd like to make before I ask my question is that political Islam, as you would prefer to call it, predates Nazism. And
Yes.
its
Yes.
anti-Semitism predates Nazism.
Yes.
So I would just like us to bear that in mind, because in the future, I think that is going to be the primary challenge when it comes to anti-Semitism. But my question is something interesting that you raised concerning Hamas and the charter of, instead of calling it the charter of Hamas, you said it's the charter of Allah.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted clarification on that. I wanted to really understand that.
Well, I suggested that to call it the Charter of Allah implies that Hamas is Allah. In other words, that the charter drafted with the help of Abdullah Azzam and others has the status of the Word of God.
They call it the
They
Charter
call it that,
of
you gotta clarify, they called it
They call it that. Yeah, they call it that.
That's what I want to know.
So, thank you. No, but you see how they appropriate the Word of God. If the Nazis usurp God, the Islamic jihadists appropriate God. This is what God says. Hezbollah describes itself as a clearinghouse for all of humanity. You got to go through Hezbollah to get into heaven, so to say. Yeah. Yes, do you have a question?
This will be the final question.
I was actually marveled by how these organizations, when they cannot find the Jew, they start to attack other people, like Boko Haram. They'll find another. So how does anti-Semitism morph like this? So if there's no Jew to attack, they'll find another person. And how do they explain that type of, I think, disconnect with what they pretend they're fighters? So it seems that the Jew is the easier target for if they're in the Middle East. But if they move into Africa where they cannot find the Jew, they'll attack maybe who they'll call the pagan or the kafir.
Or the crusader, yeah. No, that's a good question. What I say is going to provoke a lot of reaction, but this is it. Anti-Semitism, I think, is an expression of a deep desire in each of us to eliminate God. And that entails the elimination of the prohibition against murder. This is why what starts with the Jews doesn't end with the Jews. So my attack on the Jew is an expression of an attempt to eliminate the prohibition against murder, and to justify my existence, I continue to kill or murder. It goes back to how we understand what constitutes the value of a human being. Is it the commandment, don't murder, or is it my determination that I am like God, or I know the Word of God? As soon as I think I know God's Word, I can justify anything. And I will continue, like Boko Haram, I will continue to find a target, because I am here to purify existence. And Islamic jihadism is a purist movement. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much.